really was Hermann Goering? The war hero, the squadron mate of the legendary Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen, credited with 22 aerial victories in World War I, or the Reich Marshal, pompous, arrogant, dressed in his flashy, flamboyant uniform? Was he the friend of aristocrats, the man who, through his influence, managed to bring a young Adolf Hitler into the fold, into the influential circles of post-war Munich? Or was he instead the individual, the man addicted to morphine due to a wound he received during the failed coup, also in Munich, the one at the Burger Brau Keller? Was he a shrewd tactician, or was he just a cowardly manipulator? Was he the father of the Luftwaffe, or was he just a braggart? And then how did he really die? Hermann Goering, there are so many questions about this imposing figure of the Nazi Reich, even in physical stature. What we know about Hermann Goering comes from his biographies. First a young infantry officer, then quickly transferred to the newly formed German Imperial Air Force. His entry into the legendary squadron of the Red Baron, the so-called flying circus of the Jagdgeschwader I. While he had fewer victories than the Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen, who had 81, he still had 22 confirmed victories. In students who, at the time, were talking about the Great War, somewhat revived that chivalrous spirit of the Middle Ages and beyond. And yet, Hermann Goering was also a very passionate man, a man who loved beauty in every possible form. You could already see it just after the war ended, when he personally flew Baron Erich von Rosen to Sweden after becoming a civil pilot. And thanks to Baron von Rosen, he met one of the most beautiful women in Sweden, Karen, his first wife, who at the time was already married and decided to divorce her husband to be with him, even though she was already ill, suffering from epilepsy, and a few years later she would contract tuberculosis, which would prove fatal to her. In her honor, Hermann Goering would name the estate he bought several years later after Karin Hall, a kind of tribute to that beautiful woman he had loved, but loved not so much for her spirit, but rather because she represented the pinnacle of beauty. It can be said that Goering was obsessed with the values of purity and beauty to the point of being fanatical about art. During the war, Hermann Goering accumulated incredible treasures, looting them, simply plundering both private collections and major museums, including the Louvre. Of the many works of art kept in the Paris Museum, the Reich Marshal had placed a sort of personal claim on about 30% of the entire collection, which is really a lot. In some cases, Goering also had a passion for what was known as degenerate art. Imagine the Macchiaioli, but also the Expressionists, the Impressionists, the Dadaists. Everything that, according to Nazi doctrine, was supposed to be destroyed as a symbol of non-Aryan art. Well, Goering liked it, and under the pretense of personally overseeing its destruction, he took it for himself. But Goering was also something else. Goering was the father of the Luftwaffe, the Nazi military air force for World War II, an air force recreated almost from scratch, since the Treaty of Versailles had severely limited the military capacity of Weimar Germany. Let's remember, an army greatly reduced, no more than 100,000 men. A navy essentially reduced to a self-defense force with rather old ships and no submarines. And an air force that was almost non-existent, only transport planes, mainly civilian. When Hermann Goering took control of the nascent Luftwaffe in 1935, he shaped it into something that, within a few years, would become lethal. Something never seen before, a weapon capable of acting both independently and in symbiosis with the army, in what would be called the Blitzkrieg, according to the theories already advocated by General von Seeckt many years earlier. And for this reason, I invite you to watch our video dedicated to the figure of Hans von Seeckt. But Goering was also a politician, a very cunning politician. It must be said, when, at the beginning of the 1920s, he moved closer to strongly nationalist positions. He himself was already well integrated into Munich's high society of Bavaria and introduced a young Adolf Hitler, who at the time was little more than a drifter. That corporal of Austrian origin, who had enlisted in a Bavarian regiment, had fought on the front lines on the Somme. He had been wounded twice, the second time in the eyes due to gas irritation, and had become a police informant. It is Goering who will introduce Hitler into elite social circles, the circles that mattered, where, among other things, Hitler finds fertile ground to stimulate, to stoke fears of the Reds' return, those communists who had tried to establish a Soviet republic in Bavaria, getting enough money to plan the climb to power, a climb to power that, as we well know, did not go well, at least at the beginning. With the Bürgerbräukeller Putsch, which was crushed in less than 24 hours, Goering managed to escape the subsequent crackdown. He didn't end up in prison like Hitler, or like Hess, and he didn't get immediate clemency from the court, unlike, for example, Ludendorff and Ruhrl. No, Goering had to spend a period in exile, abroad, and it was there that he began to become addicted to a morphine derivative. He was wounded in the groin during the riots of the Putsch itself. Goering had been treated with that compound, derived from opiates, to ease the pain, and from then on, he would develop an increasingly tragic addiction, eventually becoming almost a drug addict. After returning to Germany thanks to an amnesty, he initially became a sort of right-hand man to Ernst Röhm, or even an equal to him, managing the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers, the lower ranks of the Nazi Party, those men in brown shirts who spread terror in the cities seeking confrontation, even armed with any other political faction. Then they would launch an assault at synagogues, churches, union centers, labor halls, and much more. But in 1931, something different happened. With an almost surprising move, the old president Paul von Hindenburg had given Hermann Goering, perhaps under pressure from conservative circles, the rank of General of Infantry, and after taking off the brown SA uniform, Goering put on the new uniform, immediately distancing himself from Röhm, to the point of becoming one of the organizers, just a few years later, of the so-called Night of the Long Knives. That early summer night when the Nazi regime carried out a real purge, a cleansing within its own ranks. Röhm and Georg Strasser were both killed by the SS, the former leader of the most radical and revolutionary wing of the Nazi Party, who had been placed on the list of enemies by Hermann Goering himself. Hermann Goering, who during the same period had begun to develop the strategy of prison camps for the enemies of the state and to theorize the creation of a secret police, the one that would become the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, which after a while would be taken from him by Himmler and entrusted to Reinhard Heydrich, and would later be merged into the later Reich Main Security Office. This was Hermann Goering before the war, but during the war, who was he? He was the Reichsmarschall, a current title given to him during the conflict. He almost became, after Hitler, who was the Reich's first soldier, its top officer, the highest-ranking commander. Even though, in reality, if you look closely, Goering never actually commanded anything or anyone, not even his Luftwaffe, even though he was very proud of it, maybe too proud, to the point of proclaiming several times that no enemy aircraft would ever dare to fly over the skies of Germany or bomb the Ruhr. Promises that were not kept. Just as the guarantees offered by Goering of air cover by the Luftwaffe during Operation Overlord, that is, the Normandy landings, would not be kept. That air cover, which would have been necessary to try to repel that massive amphibious assault, never materialized. And for this reason, too, the Allies managed to land without too many problems, except in some areas of Normandy, and from there establish a powerful bridgehead to take back Europe. So Goering was a military man, yes, but not trusted completely. Besides, by the middle of the conflict, Goering's military influence had already faded. He had become more of an organizer. He had become the head of the 4-year plan office, a plan for the continuous rearmament of Germany and for aggressive economic development, as well as for increasingly advanced new technologies. He had also become, at least initially, the organizer of a sort of Jewish migration, a forced migration meant to make Germany a land without Jews, initially by relocating them elsewhere. He was also the man, Goering, who had signed the first order to define the so-called problem of the Jewish race, the infamous final solution. It was Goering who gave the order to Reinhard Heydrich to convene a meeting in January 1942 at a villa in Wannsee, in a western suburb of Berlin, which would have changed history, but we've discussed that. Meanwhile, Goering had faded to the sidelines, but not only that. Even though he was appointed in 1941 as first in the line of succession to the Führer, after Adolf Hitler and before Hess, who would soon escape with a rather enigmatic move to Scotland. Well, Goering had almost become a pariah within the regime, and not just because his vices had become more and more evident. At a certain point, he weighed 140 kilos, something abnormal for a person of average height. And that's not all. He continued to use drugs and drink alcohol. He almost acted like a Roman emperor, with togas, tunics, red-painted nails, and a lyre to play, as if he felt like a modern Nero. To his visitors at his country estate, Karen Hall, he praised the Latin classics. He praised the Roman Empire. He said that the 1,000-year Reich would be a new Roman Empire. He would show off his art collections, those collections that, as we said, were the result of looting across Europe. He had also become a serious problem for someone. That someone was Martin Bormann, the party secretary, a sort of two-headed monster. Goering and Bormann one against the other. Bormann whispering in Hitler's ear and Goering shouting about all this, a confrontation that would end in April 1945. A particular month, a decisive month, because with the war now lost, Hitler had decided to stay in Berlin, essentially to die. We've already talked about it in another video. And while Goering didn't want to stay in Berlin, Bormann stayed with the leader. Goering, on the other hand, had retreated to Berchtesgaden, the mountain estate that Hitler liked so much, except for the Eagle's Nest. He didn't like to go there, suffering from diverticulitis. At the Berghof, Goering had opted for the final move, to take control of the Reich. After all, he had no illusions. He understood that Hitler had decided to stay. The SS stationed at Berchtesgaden basically left him free. They no longer had any hatred. Hitler is dead, Goebbels has committed suicide, Goering is useless. At that moment, Goering makes another decision, to surrender to the Americans. He knows that the Soviets would show no mercy. Maybe with the Americans, there could be a dialogue, especially because, as has already happened with other high-ranking members of the regime. For example, Himmler, Goering is convinced he can negotiate a peace, or at least sell what he knows to the Americans. Maybe even by relying on an alleged benevolence towards the Jews. Thanks also to the good offices of his brother, who was never a Nazi and actually worked to save several Jews from concentration camps and gas chambers. On May 9, 1945, exactly 24 hours after Germany's unconditional surrender signed by Keitel and Jodl, Goering surrendered to the Americans. The Americans have no intention of treating him as an equal. In fact, they lock him up in prison. Goering will be one of the main figures in the major trial, the Nuremberg trial, the trial that will make history, a trial for war crimes and also for crimes against humanity. Crimes of which Hermann Goering is also accused, despite trying to defend himself in various ways, despite testifying on the stand, but sometimes being evasive, sometimes cryptic, admitting and denying, but without giving the impression of being fully sincere or remorseful. And when the International Court pronounces the sentence death by hanging, Goering has one last surge of pride. He asks as an old soldier to be shot, but this favor is not granted to him. He will also have to be hanged. So how does he react? By committing suicide with a cyanide capsule. A capsule around which many mysteries and conjectures will develop. Some say that the capsule was provided to him by one of his jailers, an American officer with whom Goering had struck up a bit of a friendship over hunting. Others say instead that, in a more romantic version, the capsule was passed to him with a kiss by his second wife or by one of his lovers during a sort of shared conjugal visit. The most widely accepted theory is that the capsule was part of a batch of 3 capsules that Goering always carried with him. Perhaps it was the capsule that Goering carried under the lining of his coat and that he managed to hide during a personal search. Or maybe it was the capsule he kept in a jar of skin cream. He was so vain. And it stayed there until the moment he needed to use it. Or maybe it was a capsule he carried in his boots, in a small compartment in the boots, and from there he would have retrieved it to commit suicide. What is certain is that after dying from biting that cyanide capsule, the body of Hermann Goering was still shown to the public. It was shown after all the other hangings had been carried out. The last one was that of Arthur Schlesinger. Why was it shown? To avoid speculation, to prevent dark legends from arising, stories of supposed escapes or rescues, or safe conducts. No, Hermann Goering, the corpulent, fat, heroin addict, art lover, former Reich Marshal, is dead. He died 76 years ago now, and there is a rather strange memory of him. A memory of the man who had revived aviation but at the same time had plundered the art of Europe. Of the man who loved beauty but had grown so out of shape that he was almost impossible to fit into any uniform. So, in Berlin, at the end of the 1930s, there was a joke going around about Hermann Goering. It was said that Hitler, at the end of the Night of the Long Knives, was surprised to find out that Ernst Einstein was homosexual. And so people would say, I wonder how the Führer will react when he realizes that Himmler is nearsighted, that Hess is stupid, that Goebbels limps, and that, in the end, Hermann Goering is just a cunning fat man.